Hi, welcome to my journey. My name is Cherie, and this is my vlog. Okay. Hmm. Okay, almost let another day get away from me, and it's a beautiful day. I mean, the weather is warm. There's not a lot of sun rays, but the weather is warm. It is now 3:30. And I'm getting out and about, to spend my hour outside. I've been having an upset stomach. And I think it's because of the medication that I've been taking. So I finally went ahead and decided to reach out and communicate with one of my friends of, let's see, it must have been about a little over 40 years ago. Okay, and decided to not just text, but actually do some FaceTime, right? So I actually did FaceTime, basically, to see whether or not, me and her were going to be long-term friends, right? She's a Libra, right? She calls everybody her friend. Right? She does. She calls everybody her friend, and therefore everybody is her friend. Right? Me, I've always found it a little dangerous calling folks my friend that wasn't my friend, and it even got more dangerous calling people family that wasn't my family. Yeah. Right? Because those bonds always seem to be like some type of bond of out of necessity, right? Either they have more money than you, or you have more money than them, right? Or they have more influence than you, or you have more influence than them, right? It was that weird bondship, right? So today I was watching Evelina, right? Evelina. I suspect she's under 25, right? And she, is learning a lot. Let's just say it like that. I believe she's learning a lot. But the most important thing that she's not learning is she's in this strange type of relationship, and this relationship has happened for 7 years, right? They're not married, right? And I guess they enjoy the idea that, yes, when it gets so bad, they could just walk away, right? And I mean, that to me is cute the first 2 years. In my book, yeah, that's cute, right? Wow, we're so glad that we found this out, early in the game, and now we could just walk away. However, at what point is your time not considered valuable, right? So if let's just say she's 25, right? If she's 25 years old and she's been in this relationship with this guy for 7 years, then she's been with him since she was 18. Right? Now, God knows that she didn't know that he would become like a defector from Russia. Right? God knows that she doesn't know that what she is describing as Russia is not all of Russia, because Russia is more diversified than she even realizes. And this is true of most countries. Most countries don't even realize how diversified their country is until they find out, right? When you FAFO, right? When you FAFO, then you're shocked. Like, what? Right. So she was talking about, about long-term relationships, right? Friendships, right? And interesting enough, if you live in a small town, it's easy. It's easy to maintain long-term friendships if you and your friends never move out of that town. You maintain a relationship with that friend even when it's a bad friendship. Right? I never even, that's where, when they had came out with that movie called Fiends, right? Fiends, frenemies, right? I was like, exactly. Not everybody that you grew up with is a friend that you need for your highest good, right? Because Andrea, for whatever purpose, and I did kind of tell her that, my brother, was hinting around to me that the only reason why she was my friend is because of her affections towards him, right? And I told her, I said, hey, it's a beautiful thing that, we're still, friends and in contact with each other, and I'm sorry it didn't work out between you and my brother, but it probably never would, because, innately he's a pedophile, right? He really only likes and enjoys and adores, young girls, young, like young, like, still in their teens, young, okay? So, we did a FaceTime, and I noticed that, we did connect, on several levels, right? And I know when I talk to her, and she's a Libra, it's like I shift into, my Taurus energy, because Taurus and Libra are both, ruled by Venus. And so we connect on that level, right? And it was interesting enough that, it was downloaded to me that Taurus is, yes, this is the divine feminine energy of the single-minded egos, and Libra is the divine energy of the plural-minded. Okay? It made all the sense in the world to me, right? I kind of call it, thought about it in those terms before, but when I was talking with her and you know, seeing and speaking to her on an energetic level, it made sense to me. Okay? So you know, of course, you know, we were talking about, you know, how here we are, you know, both at, you know, as senior women. You know, I really didn't know how old she was. I didn't realize she was only a few years younger than me. But you know, I guess, you know, we were within 4 years, and being like within 4 years, you know, you're kind of still in the same, you know, school age range, right? So she may have been, you know, she may be, she says she's 62, I'm 64, right? She would still be like, if I was in junior high school, you know, 2 years later, she would be in that same, you know, high school or junior high school or whatever. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, you know, not that far in age, you know, kind of puts people in that same school age range, right? Because listen, the things that, you know, I believe that they're teaching the children today, you know, is a lot different than, you know, what they taught us when we were growing up, right? What they taught us when we were growing up, you know, they were still speculating. You know, they were still theorizing. You know, this is believes that and believes this, right? Then when they figure out, you know, tests and scientific ways, you know, to prove or disprove, then that's where they get more confidence in how they're teaching, in the teaching methods, and whether or not they state something is a fact or something is just a theory, right? Now, when it comes to like Darwin, right? Darwin, who theorized that, you know, women, that women would be envious of a man's dick, right? I think that was truly a projection. It was his theory. However, it was one that men loved. They're like, yes, yay, we want that one, you know, and let's put that one at the forefront. And that's the one that men sort of, you know, was led also to believe through, you know, the manosphere and their indoctrination of what it is to be a man. When in essence, it was really men who envy other men. Women rarely even see another man's dick, right? And yet, men will shower together. They had bathing houses created just so men could bathe together. Yes, they did. Men will walk around, you know, exposing their whole bodies and maybe, have, like the same coverage as a fig leaf, you know, and especially towards other men, because they compare each other to one another, right? However, women, we really don't see that, right? Most of the time when we see men either in uniform, in attire, and even sometimes when it comes to being in the house, they're in loungewear, right? Now, I had a conversation with one man who said, hey, you need to get your grown kids, not me, where he was saying that his woman needed to get her grown kids out of the house because he wanted to be able to walk around the house butt naked. Right? And I had to really ponder on that one, and I was like, and of course my mind is like, yeah, privacy costs a lot of money. You hope that the kids will get on their own feet and have their own family and are able to take care of themselves. Then you don't have to have them at home. However, if they're not doing that, then you want them to come home. You want them to come home and regroup and try to establish themselves financially before getting out in the world. Because if you get out in the world and your foundation is weak, somebody's gonna kick your foundation out from under you, and boom, next thing you know, you're operating at a huge disadvantage. A huge disadvantage. So, now, when it came to my relationships, none of them even passed, the family support, right? What I'm saying is my relationships, they weren't sanctioned with the blessings of the family. Okay? And, the men that I was with, they knew that, right? And typically what a man is supposed to do when he realizes that he's not getting the support of the family, what he needs to do is, to get out of his feelings, right? He needs to get out of his feelings because obviously, there's a difference in value. So when we start talking about a difference in value, how does that happen? Well, the reason why there's a difference in value, it happens when, people misinterpret, religious words, right? It's kind of what they do, like, especially in Christianity, right? They're like, oh, the language is ambiguous, because there's, it gives wiggle room for interpretation, whatever. Okay. But as soon as you know, get away from the original intention of the word, then it turns into a paganism, right? Now, some people will say, oh, paganism means that, you're just completely without any faith. No, that's not true, right? Because even Jesus said, a pagan can also be a virtuous person. Okay? So today, I woke up saying to myself, my goodness, this is the longest friendship that I ever had. This was 40 years plus, right? And a lot of the other people that I hadn't, stayed in contact with, a lot of them, they're just missing. They're gone. Who knows what happened to them? My brother told me that a lot of them were either in jail or, drugged out of their head and, and lost, down Hobo Lane. So sometimes it's not good, to hold on to, these memories. How warm is it out there? Oh hell, it's 76 degrees outside. I was wondering why these people were out here in their tank tops. So then I started thinking about my first marriage, right? Well, when I went to go claim my my pension, right? It dawned on me that one of the reasons why they were asking, well, needing to take so long in determining, my pension is they have to now investigate the records as to whether or not you were married, because that's one of the questions that are on there. Have you been married? Are you married now? Well, yeah, I had to tell them, yeah, I've been married. I'm divorced. I'm not married and not married now. That's all they wanted to hear. They did not want to hear when and who, where, how. No, that just meant that, okay, since this person has been married, we need to investigate to see if any of my spouses are entitled to portions of my pension. Right? And come to find out that only 20% of the population in America even receive a pension. So I feel a little fortunate about that. I do. And thank you God, because if I hadn't been working all of those years to receive a pension and made it a priority, that I would have been asked the fuck out. I would have been with my other compadres, trying to survive by any means necessary. And then, probably self-medicating because the shit is so harsh. Right? That life is so harsh, that I want to escape, right? And that's what my mom used to tell me. She says, hey, people sit up here and they say that, getting high and, and drinking and stuff, is fun. But she said, no, on the other side of that coin, those people are escapisms. Are trying to escape reality. And then, of course, you know, we quickly bridged onto, the topic of what is reality. Both my parents were very cerebral type of individuals. Am I too far over? No, I'm not that far over. So yeah. So a lot of people are using this time to come down here to walk along the lake because the weather is moderate, it's nice, it's overcast, but it doesn't look like signs of rain. And it's warm, it's 76 degrees, damn near 80 degrees out here in January. While, other parts of the country are really suffering, flooding and cold weather. We have been blessed. We have been blessed. So, of my two marriages, neither one of my marriages sustained any portion of my pension, right? They were foolish, right? And I already know my first husband, who refused to give me a divorce, I guess, he was holding on to what he thought was a cash cow, right? But, fortunately, I did remarry, even if it was for 2 years, and then, we started divorce proceedings. It was enough to relinquish any claims that he could possibly, try to put on, our marriage, where, he was in and out, in the relationship, and abandoned me, after we were married, right? And back then, it wasn't acceptable, to be, an abandoned marriage, 40 some years ago, because, they wanted to discourage that. And so if the man would say, no, I refuse to give her, a divorce, that doesn't guarantee that he's going to provide her with provisions or even protection. So where, he abandoned both me and his child, even though he says that's not his child. And back then, they did have paternity tests. He could have demanded a paternity test. But he didn't. He just abandoned. I think because he knew deep down, it didn't matter. It didn't matter who I spoke to, right? I just wasn't a person that, just speaking to people wasn't a connection to me. And definitely, you had to be very articulate to monopolize my mind with game. And even getting drunk or getting high didn't stop me from being who I was. You know how some people, they'll tell you that alcohol, makes them more relaxed. Well, you have to be a relaxed person to get more relaxed. If indeed, you're going to get relaxed off of alcohol. Otherwise, it just uninhibits who you really are, right? So when I'm drinking alcohol, I'm argumentative, I want facts, I like to debate, I'll argue premises, and of course for me, this is civilized arguments. This isn't shouting and ad hominems and gang stalking, slippery slides and all of that shit. No, it ain't none of that, right? Ain't no sense in arguing if that's what it's gonna be about, right? It's just, for me, it's like, no, this don't make sense, and it definitely is not gonna put any dollars in my pocket to sit up here and bow down to a fool. Ha! Right? So, and we didn't call it gaslighting. We didn't use those terms as gaslighting. Right? We just called him a fool. And kept it pushing. But, all of these, interpretations and delicate words, that they use to try to explain, misbehavior, I guess there's a purpose to it. I guess it makes more sense that if they say, oh, look, we studied this, we've determined that this, and this, and so that's why we categorize it for this, right? And that's where, it was stated that once they come to categorize you, right, they categorize you for control, right? The whole thing is to control. Once you get categorized, if you get categorized in a certain race, they feel like they have control in their minds as to how to think about you. Right? And, and it is true, right? I mean, if we just have two genders, right, and we can categorize one as one or the other, it's very simple. It's manageable for a lot of people. But once we can't categorize you as either or, then it gets really complicated. Like when I got into weighing about 145 pounds, and because I didn't have, that much fat on my body, a lot of people, asked me if I was a man. And I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you mean, am I a man? I didn't know that there was this whole movement out here of men, transgressing over into becoming women. This guy is going about 10 miles an hour up a hill. He's probably tired. So, today is Thursday. What the hell? Was I recording on my watch? Oh my goodness. Say it ain't so. I believe it's the 8th. Yeah. January 8th, 2026. Okay, it's a bear on the lawn. I haven't did my walk today. I did do my lightweight exercises this morning. And I went back to sleep. But basically the whole conversation is, out of my 2 marriages, neither one of them paid off. Neither one of them provided and supported my existence. Right? Neither one of them, even after separation, felt that they owed me anything to live off of. Now, of course, in the midst of when they were enchanted with me, they promise you everything, right? Follow me and I'll take care of you, and if it doesn't work out, they'll just walk away and give you everything. Of course they all say that until it happens. And then when it happens, they're like, I don't have no agreement with you. Why would I have an agreement with somebody that we're not together? If we're not together, you see? And that's when my mind was clicking, like saying, okay, so the agreements that you say to me are only based off of us still being together. And once we're not together, then you're saying all contracts are broken. Even the ones that said, hey, if we break up, I'll take care of you. Or if we break up, I'll help you with the kids. If we break up, Now, honestly, the only person that's been like in the background, right, is a boomer man, right? Is a boomer man. He's a boomer, former Mason, right? Or could still be a Mason. Who knows? You know, he pretty much kept his word to a certain degree. To a certain degree. More than some of these young people. These young people today, they'll lie to get you, lie to get rid of you, right? Lie to try to keep, you know, a facade. You know, it's just, wow, you know. And the whole thing is that, you know, they have the concept that everybody lies, right? And that there will always be liars, right? So now I know better than to deal with people who have that, you know, belief system, right? Because it shouldn't be a belief system. Lying at best should be an exception, right? That, you know, you could say, you know, no, they're generally an honest person, and if they had lied, it was to protect probably, you know, their loved ones, right? Not to protect yourself, because, you know, whatever you do, you know, I'm sure you intended to do it when you did it, right? It just may not have had the results that you wanted after you did it. So I don't think I'm going to get out and walk. I thought about getting out and walking, but I don't want to get out and walk. I just don't want to. And it ain't because the weather's bad, because the weather's nice out here. So the moral of the story is, if I hadn't decided to choose myself, right? My first husband was a diehard, you know, you should follow your man, you know, right or wrong, you know. And I said, you mean to tell me I should follow my man and live in the gutter with him? Hell no, right? Because, you know, he was an artist, right? And he didn't feel like, you know, he should do anything else, right? And I'm like, look, you know, I have artistic abilities myself, and I had a choice, right? Do I keep being an artist with the understanding that most artists in this world starve, even though there are some successful artists, even though there are some artists that we're not gonna do that, even though we know that there are some artists, you know, that can sell their artwork for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, right? But if they're an artist that is able, you know, to create artwork of that magnitude, you know, how much time, how much supplies did they, you know, spend on that particular artwork? Right? And, you know, overall, you know, what ended up being their hourly wage, right? And then you have to also factor in that not every piece of their artwork is going to bring about the same amount of benefits, right? Which was one of the reasons why a lot of the artists had decided, in order, to get a living, make a living out of being an artist, they had to call on different spirits. And they developed, an artistic group that also became a spiritual group, right? Because they had to support one another. They had to get support, to live. It was a whole thing that they had to do, and that's how they came across, a different kind of paganism, right? I mean, you could be a high-level pagan, such as Illuminati, or you could be a low-level paganism, which is, a secular occult. You can even be the lowest of the low pagan, that is a rebel, individualistic person. And you make up your own rules as you go. According to man. Now let's keep it real. That's according to man, right? Now women, on the other hand, we live restrictions, right? We live that shit, we need to shit every day, at least once. We need to piss and shit and eat at least once a day. We understand that. Men, they don't. They don't want to understand that. Now, going back to, my curiosity, right? My curiosity about these people that make claims that they had evolved to the point where they don't need food and that they feed off of light. That's a very interesting concept. If this is what we're evolving to, then would it make sense to admire the people that have the food, right? Would it make sense to admire the people who hoard the food? Would it make sense to admire the apex predator? Because you don't need food. You don't eat. Period. You don't eat flesh. You don't eat vegetables. You don't eat. You're not a carnivore. You're not a vertebrate. No. You're not even an omnivore. No. You don't eat food, right? And when they were asked, well, what is it that they do eat? They said they feed off of light. Okay, so are these people like a plant? which is what my mind went to. It's like, what? You know, because on one hand, I'm like, okay, so you've crystallized, your organs or whatever, and now, you're sustaining yourself. Off of photons? Yeah. So that really brought came to my attention. And of course, I spoke with my guides and I said, look, if that is indeed a possibility, to be able to, sustain ourselves without the need of food, right? That is a very high spiritual position indeed, right? Because now you don't have to be a predator. Now you don't even have to participate really even in the sharing of labor because you don't need food. Okay? However, that to me still only comes across as a choice that you can make, once you're fully developed. Once, it wouldn't make sense to do that before you're fully developed. It just wouldn't make sense. So anyway, that's something that, otherwise, mothers wouldn't have to be carrying mammal glands. And that's why I guess it won't make sense to me because I'm a woman. Right? Not to say that I wouldn't enjoy not having mammal glands. I think that would be a blessing. Right? And will cut down, my risk of ever having breast cancer. But that's one of the reasons why women have breast cancer is because they have mammal glands. And if that was to happen, where we don't have to have mammal glands, then I would have to, it would be difficult. It's difficult for me to wrap my head as to, well, how will we be categorized after that point? We wouldn't be able to categorize ourselves as mammals. We would have to be redefined. Anyway, I'm getting ready to go over here into Sam's. I want to price to see how much their eggs, their Parmesan cheese, and probably get one of their rotisserie chickens. Because, you know, I haven't taken out anything, you know, to cook. Right? So I think it is a good time for me to go buy another rotisserie chicken from Sam's. And if I could buy, you know, a large quantity of eggs, because I'm thinking I want to get on this this egg diet. Kind of like an egg diet. Kind of. Right? And that's because, you know, they're just getting just ridiculous when it comes to, you know, meat. You know, the cost of meat is just ridiculous. Even though it's come down, it has come down. You know, especially if you have the money to buy it in a large quantity. But I'm going to be honest. Meat has not tasted the same to me. I promise you. You know how I was craving meat, right? And then not being able to eat the meat, right? And then I grinded up the meat, right? I told you about it, right? I said, you know, we're gonna make meat cutlets, right? And I was able to eat the meat as a cutlet, but not. You'd be surprised how much of that meat I gave to the dogs. So it's causing me to believe that my feelings about meat is changing a lot. I'll let you have that spot, buddy. Let me go down here. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm like, okay, well, you know, I'm gonna still need to get my protein, period. Okay, I'm gonna still need to get my protein. And I know I do like eggs, even though it does seem like even my taste for eggs is not as strong as it used to be. Because I like eggs scrambled, boiled, easy over, poached, you name it. I like it. So we're going to go in here and we're going to buy some eggs anyway. Because I think they have come down from their ridiculous price of like $5 a dozen, $6 a dozen. Let's go and find out.